Have you ever wondered why Hans Moleman, the unluckiest man in Springfield, keeps dying and coming back like nothing happened? Today we're diving deep into every single one of Hans Moleman's bizarre deaths, decoding the mystery behind this running gag that's puzzled Simpsons fans for decades. Welcome back, Simpsons fans! In today's video, we're counting down every single time Hans Moleman has met his tragic, hilarious, and often absurd fate. From falling into fiery pits to getting flattened by random objects, Moleman's deaths are legendary. But is there a deeper meaning behind his endless suffering, or is it all just one big joke? Stick around, because we're uncovering the truth behind the many deaths of Hans Moleman. Hans Moleman, the man, the myth, the walking punchline of The Simpsons, is perhaps the most mysterious and unlucky citizen of Springfield. Whenever we see him, he's either narrowly escaping death, meeting it head-on, or simply existing in the most unfortunate ways possible. But before we start counting the many times this tiny, wrinkled man has met his end, we have to understand where it all began, because Hans Moleman wasn't always the iconic gag character we know today. In fact, his origin story is as weird and surprising as the character himself. Hans first appeared in the third season of The Simpsons in an episode titled Homer vs. Lisa and the Eighth Commandment? He wasn't even called Hans Moleman back then? Nope, he was simply listed as Ralph Mellish in the script, a character who looked more like an elderly mole than a human being. He had the thick glasses, the hunchback, the sunken face, and that slow, croaky voice that sounded like life itself had worn him down over the years. The animators didn't expect him to become anything more than a one-time character, a little background joke to fill a scene. But something about him clicked with the writers, the fans, and eventually the entire show. As The Simpsons evolved, Hans Moleman was renamed Hans Moleman, and this tiny change in name completely altered his destiny. The name alone felt like a gag waiting to happen. Moleman, half man, half mole, living a life under the shadow of Springfield's chaos. He quickly became the embodiment of bad luck, an unlucky charm walking through town with zero awareness of the danger constantly surrounding him. There's something almost poetic about it. While Homer gets into trouble by being reckless and Bart causes chaos intentionally, Hans Moleman just exists, and that alone seems to invite disaster his way. The writers leaned into this concept more and more as seasons went on. Hans wasn't like any other Springfield resident. While characters like Moe, Apu, or Ned had backstories, relationships, and arcs that grew over time, Hans remained static, frozen in his role as Springfield's eternal victim. He was there to take the fall, literally and figuratively, in every way possible. He was the guy you could drop off a cliff, set on fire, or crush under a car, and the audience would laugh because, deep down, we all knew Hans Moleman wasn't just a person. He was a concept, a living, breathing, running gag. His design played a huge role in this as well. Moleman's tiny stature, huge glasses, and permanent frown made him instantly recognizable. He looked like life had defeated him decades ago, yet somehow he kept going, or at least coming back after each horrific death. Fans started noticing how, despite dying in one episode, he would show up alive and well in the next, as if nothing had happened. This gave birth to theories that Hans Moleman wasn't just unlucky, he might be immortal or stuck in some kind of Springfield time loop where consequences do and exist. What's even funnier is that the writers themselves never fully explained Hans Moleman's existence. In interviews, some admitted that Moleman became a favorite because he was the perfect blank slate for humor. You could throw any tragedy his way, and it would work because he had no ties, no backstory, nothing to lose. He was the ultimate cartoon punching bag. Yet fans loved him for it. His soft, trembling voice, famously delivering lines like "I was saying boo-earns" or "My name is Hans, drinking has ruined my life. I'm 31 years old," only added to his legend. That last line became one of the funniest in Simpsons history because Hans Moleman, looking 90 years old on a good day, claiming to be 31, perfectly captured the absurdity of his character. Over time, Hans became a cult favorite. He wasn't in every episode, but whenever he appeared, audiences knew something bad or hilarious was about to happen. The writers used him like seasoning in a dish. Too much Hans Moleman, and the joke might wear thin. But sprinkle him in at the right moment, give him a tragic line or a brutal accident, and the scene became instantly unforgettable. What makes Hans Moleman so unique in Springfield is how he bridges humor and mystery. He doesn't speak much, but when he does, his lines are either painfully sad or absurdly funny. He doesn't chase the spotlight, yet he steals every scene he's in. He started as a background character, a random nobody, and somehow became the beating heart of one of The Simpsons' longest-running inside jokes. And when you think about it, the sheer fact that a character designed as a one-off gag ended up becoming a legend speaks volumes about how The Simpsons built its universe. When we talk about the first recorded death of Hans Moleman, we're stepping into the moment where The Simpsons writers realized they had stumbled upon comedic gold. Hans didn't start as the perpetual victim we know today. At first, he was just another Springfield resident, wandering through scenes with his quiet, almost apologetic presence. But it didn't take long for the creative team to realize that Moleman's very existence seemed to invite disaster. And it all began in one unforgettable moment that would set the tone for the rest of his animated life, or rather lives. The first time Hans Moleman met his tragic fate came in the classic episode, Homer versus Lisa and the Eighth Commandment, where he was driving his car and got into a rather abrupt accident. At the time, it wasn't played as a huge gag, but looking back, this was the birth of a running joke that would span decades. What made it memorable was the randomness of it all. Moleman wasn't the star of the episode, nor was his death central to the plot. He was just there, minding his own business, when the universe, or in this case, the writers decided he had to suffer for the sake of comedy. This was the beauty of Moleman's first recorded demise. It was sudden, it was absurd, and it was oddly hilarious because it came out of nowhere. Unlike other characters in The Simpsons who often find themselves in trouble because of their personalities, Homer's recklessness, Bart's mischief, or even Ned Flanders' bad luck masked by Faith, Hans Moleman didn't have a personality trait that caused chaos. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, every single time. That first death established him as the ultimate victim, the guy Springfield would chew up and spit out without a second thought, and audiences noticed. There was something strangely captivating about this quiet, soft-spoken man meeting such an unfortunate end. He wasn't loud, he wasn't dramatic, he wasn't even angry about it. He just accepted whatever tragedy befell him with the same tired, weary expression, as though he had lived through countless misfortunes before we ever met him. That stoicism, combined with his frail appearance, made the comedy hit even harder. The animators leaned into his design during these early episodes, making sure Moleman looked like the kind of person tragedy would seek out. His enormous glasses hid half his face, his hunched posture suggested a lifetime of defeats, and his shuffling walk made him seem like he was always 2 seconds away from falling apart. So when he got crushed, burned, or run over, it was never shocking, it was inevitable. But the writers didn't stop there. After that first accident, they realized they had found the perfect recipe for quick, punchy humor. Moleman could appear anywhere, in any episode, and you knew something bad was going to happen to him. He became Springfield's sacrificial lamb, the guy who could take a hit so the bigger characters didn't have to. You can't have Homer getting flattened by a giant boulder every week. That would ruin the story. But Hans Moleman, he was free game. He didn't need development or explanation. He existed for one reason: to suffer in the funniest way possible. That first death was also the start of a mystery that fans would later obsess over. How on earth does Hans Moleman keep coming back? Each time we see him after a seemingly fatal incident, today we're going to be looking at the one person in Springfield who may actually be immortal. But why has no one noticed? Why does no one care? And why is he still getting resurrected over and over again? Well, today we're looking at the Hans Moleman phenomenon. So we all know Hans. He is that German exchange student who came to Springfield to learn about American culture, and instead found himself repeatedly dying horrible and painful deaths every single episode. I mean, he must have died over 100 times by now, right? That's just a guess, it's probably more than that. But do you remember his first time dying? Yeah, because it was so shocking. I don't think any of us will ever forget. It was in the second episode of Season 2 when Hans dies for the very first time on screen. In Dancing Homer, when Homer was trying to get back into the good graces of Marge after spending all their money on a pair of erotic dancing shoes, he ends up entering a chili cook-off to win some money for a new TV. However, Homer accidentally puts salt instead of sugar into the recipe, and soon his chili is so unbearably salty that everyone who samples it is literally killed instantly. Okay, yeah. Of course, Hans is one of these people, but this was also the first and only time that we see him die on screen. In fact, off-screen, we've never seen any character in The Simpsons die except for comic book guy in Treehouse of Horror. So how did Hans come back to life? No one really knows. But from this moment on, whenever he appeared in an episode, he would always be alive. But then later in Season 2, in the episode Bart's Dog Gets an F, Hans dies for the second time. This time in a much more iconic fashion. Bart had just broken Principal Skinner's prized goldfish, which he kept in his office. And in order to distract Skinner while Bart made a run for it, Milhouse told Skinner that he'd seen Hans smoking in the bathroom. Principal Skinner stormed into the bathroom and found Hans taking out a cigarette, and then proceeded to beat him so brutally that Hans ended up exploding into a bloody mist. This was quite different to the previous time we saw him die. Not only was this scene played completely straight without any comedic relief, but there was also blood and guts and a very unceremonious exit. And this wasn't the last time that Hans would explode either. In Bart Gets an Elephant, he exploded a second time when Mr. Burns threw a switch to activate the self-destruct on the elephant. And in The Springfield Files, he exploded for a third time when the alien parasite took over his body and began wreaking havoc on the Springfield Elementary School field trip. And yet, another thing I want to point out here is that both he and Ralph survived these events, unscathed and with no explanation whatsoever. So, although we never saw Hans die on screen, he was being brought back to life frequently throughout the series, and seemingly no one else in Springfield ever noticed. Now you might be thinking, wow, Hans must have died at least 5 or 6 times by now, but actually that's not true. Because in Hurricane Nettie, Hans died for the 4th time, this time in one of the most painful ways possible. After a hurricane devastated Springfield, causing chaos and destruction everywhere, Hans and his friend were inside a car trying to drive home, but they soon found themselves stuck in the middle of a flooded street. And while they were waiting for help, a passing motorist offered to tow them home for free. Hans accepted, but soon discovered the motorist had sinister intentions. When he turned around to thank the man, he found that he and his friend had been tied to the tow truck and were slowly being pulled towards a giant wood chipper. Before they could escape, the two friends were sucked into the machine and dismembered, with Hans screaming, "I don't want to die, but I'm pretty sure I am." Yet again, though, somehow, someway, Hans came back to life. And in fact, he died a 5th time in Lisa S. Substitute when she accidentally hit him with a baseball bat. Then a 6th time in The Secret War of Lisa Simpson when he was crushed by a bulldozer. And then a 7th time in The Principal and the Pauper when the real Principal Skinner blew up the fake Principal Skinner. Okay, let's take a moment here. By this point, I think we can all agree that something weird is going on with Hans Moleman. He's dead every single episode, and yet he keeps coming back to life and no one cares. There are no consequences for these actions. No one even notices that he died. The townspeople just move on with their day. This raises a lot of questions. Like, how many times has Hans died? Is he actually immortal? And if not, why doesn't he stay dead? Let's look at what evidence we have for Hans being immortal. Well, the first clue is that he seems to die very casually, almost every single episode, which seems strange. Because if you died every time you stubbed your toe, you'd be dead a lot. And this is basically what happens to Hans. In the Cartridge Family, he was killed by a bullet that went through his brain. And in Saddle Sir Gallividian, he was shot through the eye. In Homer, he was nailed through the head. And in Old Yeller Belly, he got impaled through the head. And in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, he was crushed by a bowling ball. The next clue that Hans may be immortal is that he always comes back to life. Instantly, he's never resurrected by magic. He's not brought back through science. He's not brought back by love. He just comes back to life, which implies that he has some sort of supernatural ability that allows him to cheat death itself. Now, what's interesting here is that in worst episode ever, we finally got an explanation for how Hans keeps dying. In the cold open, we find out that in an alternate timeline where Matt Groening gave up on The Simpsons, Hans became an evil warlord and conquered Springfield. In the present day, Hans tried to warn everyone about this dark future, but no one listened to him. Then the real Matt Groening appeared and reset the timeline, restoring the world to normal. In doing so, he trapped Hans in a time loop that condemned him to die over and over again. There's a few problems with this theory, though. First of all, it doesn't explain why Hans is 31 years old, despite having apparently lived through multiple wars and other historic events that should have killed him. Secondly, there's no reason to assume that Hans would become an evil warlord if Matt Groening gave up on The Simpsons. And finally, if Matt Groening can restore timelines simply by writing good scripts, then why can't he just write a script that kills Hans Moleman permanently? Why does he keep bringing Hans back to life episode after episode? Now, one fan theory is that because Hans is the worst character on the show, Matt Groening feels bad for giving him such a terrible existence and therefore feels compelled to bring him back to life every single episode. But I'm sorry, that's just wrong. You don't torture a character for 33 years just to feel bad about it, and it's definitely not the real reason. Instead, my own personal theory is that Hans is immortal, but he doesn't know it himself. Think about it. Every time he dies, he starts panicking and screaming, "I don't want to die," which implies that if he died, he wouldn't come back to life. If he knew that he was immortal, he wouldn't react like that. So that means that Hans isn't immortal, yet he always comes back to life. So the only conclusion we can draw is that he is immortal. The entire town of Springfield has seen this man die hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times, and they all seem to accept it as completely normal. It's like Hans dying every single episode is just part of their everyday lives. They don't even notice anymore. And honestly, that's kind of sad. Can you imagine if someone near you kept dying every single day? It's like Springfield has become numb to the suffering of this poor man. But what do you think? Does Hans Moleman actually die every episode? Is he immortal? And if so, why doesn't he realize it? Let me know your thoughts down below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like. If you want to see more, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you really want to support the channel, consider becoming a member. Thank you for watching. Frenzy. How can someone who looks like a walking skeleton be in his early 30s? Maybe because time doesn't work the same way for him as it does for everyone else. Maybe he's been alive for centuries, cursed to walk the earth in the body of a man who seems ancient but never actually dies. Some fans even point to the way other characters treat Hans as evidence for the theory. Nobody ever reacts to his deaths with shock or sadness. No one questions how he's alive again after being crushed or set on fire. It's like the entire town just knows that Hans Moleman can't die, so they don't even bother worrying about him. Springfield is full of weird characters, sure, but Hans takes it to another level. He exists outside the normal rules of the show's universe, almost like he's in on a joke the rest of us aren't privy to. And then there's the meta explanation, which might be the strangest of them all. Some fans suggest Hans Moleman knows he's in a cartoon. Maybe he's aware that he can't die because none of it is real. That every accident, every explosion, every moment of suffering will be erased by the next episode. That would make Hans Moleman the most self-aware character on The Simpsons without ever saying it outright. His tired expression, his acceptance of fate, his lack of surprise at the chaos around him, it all fits. It's like he's looking at the audience, silently telling us he knows this will happen again and again, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. Whether he's immortal, cursed, or just the writer's favorite target for dark humor, the result is the same. Hans Moleman has become more than just a background character. He's a mystery, a piece of Simpsons lore that fans keep debating decades after his first appearance. Every time he dies, it adds another layer to the legend. Is he a man, a myth, a cosmic joke? The show never gives us answers, and maybe that's the point. The less we know about Hans Moleman, the funnier and stranger he becomes. When you start digging into the behind-the-scenes world of The Simpsons, Hans Moleman quickly emerges as one of those characters who was never supposed to become anything more than a one-off joke. The writers, animators, and producers have often talked about how so many iconic moments on the show happened almost by accident, and Hans Moleman is a perfect example of that creative chaos. He was originally just a background character, created to fill space in Springfield, the kind of guy who might show up once or twice for a quick laugh before disappearing forever. But as it turns out, the smallest, most insignificant characters sometimes capture the writer's imaginations in ways nobody expects. And Hans Moleman went from being a nobody to one of the most legendary running gags in the history of the show. The animators have admitted that Hans wasn't even called Hans Moleman at first. He appeared in early drafts with different names, like Ralph Malish, and was designed as an elderly man who looked like life had been beating him down for decades. His enormous glasses, sunken cheeks, and frail frame made him look like someone who had seen too much, someone who might collapse under the weight of the world at any moment. And maybe that was the key. The design itself was so funny, so instantly recognizable that it begged for a joke. And the joke became this: what if we keep putting this poor guy through absolute hell over and over until it becomes one of the show's signature bits? Writers like John Swartzwelder and Mike Rice have hinted in interviews that Hans Moleman became a sort of blank canvas for physical comedy. They could do anything to him: drop a boulder on him, set him on fire, hit him with a football, and nobody would complain because Hans wasn't tied to any bigger storylines. He didn't have a family, he didn't have relationships, he didn't even seem to have a job most of the time. That freedom made him the perfect target for the kind of dark, absurd humor that The Simpsons was becoming famous for in the early seasons. Other characters had limits, but Hans Moleman, he was free real estate for comedy gold. What's really fascinating is how the writers started to notice that fans were responding to Hans Moleman in a big way. They thought he was just a background gag, but the audience saw something more. Every time Hans appeared, people laughed. Every time something horrible happened to him, it became a highlight of the episode. And because The Simpsons was known for building a universe full of recurring jokes and hidden references, Hans Moleman fit right in. The writers realized they had stumbled onto a character who didn't need development or screen time to be hilarious. All he had to do was show up, suffer in some ridiculous way, and disappear again, only to come back in the next episode like nothing ever happened. Matt Groening himself once joked that Hans Moleman was like the Wile E. Coyote of the Simpsons universe. No matter how many times he fell off a cliff or got blown to pieces, he was always back for more, doomed to repeat the same cycle of suffering forever. And that comparison makes sense because Hans brought that same kind of cartoon logic into a show that was otherwise rooted in satire and character-driven humor. The Simpsons wasn't Looney Tunes, it was known for clever writing, social commentary, and parody, but Hans Moleman brought a touch of pure slapstick chaos into the mix. Even the voice behind Hans Moleman, Don Castellaneta, has talked about how much fun it was to bring this character to life. That shaky, defeated voice he gives Hans is part of what makes him so funny. Lines like, "I was saying boo-earns" or "drinking has ruined my life," "I am only 31 years old," are delivered with such sincerity and sadness that they become hilarious by contrast. Don has mentioned that he never expected Hans Moleman to become such a fan favorite, but the combination of that voice, the ridiculous situations, and the writer's love for dark humor turned Hans into something bigger than anyone planned. Behind the scenes, the writers often looked for ways to outdo themselves with each new Hans Moleman appearance. If he got hit by a football in one episode, maybe he would get buried alive in the next. If he crashed his car this week, maybe he'd get set on fire next week. It became a running competition in the writer's room to come up with the funniest, most unexpected way to kill off Hans Moleman, knowing full well he'd be back in the next episode with no explanation whatsoever. That unpredictability was part of the charm. Fans never knew when he was going to show up, but when he did, they knew something outrageous was about to happen. And here is the thing the writers have admitted more than once. Hans Moleman wasn't just comic relief. He became a kind of mascot for the weird, random humor that made The Simpsons so unique. Most shows would and dare kill off the same character dozens of times and then act like it never happened. But The Simpsons embraced that absurdity. They knew Hans Moleman didn't need a backstory or continuity. He just needed one good moment per episode to make people laugh, and that was enough to turn him into a legend. When we talk about the legacy of Hans Moleman, we're not just talking about a background character who got a few laughs. We're talking about someone who, against all odds, went from a one-off joke to a cultural icon in the world of The Simpsons. Think about it. Springfield is packed with memorable faces. There's Homer, the lovable buffoon; Bart, the troublemaker; Lisa, the voice of reason. Even side characters like Moe, Apu, and Chief Wiggum have carved out their places in the hearts of fans. Yet somehow this tiny, frail, perpetually doomed man with thick glasses and a shaky voice managed to stand out without ever being the star of an episode, without having a big storyline, and without saying much at all. That's the strange magic of Hans Moleman. He became a legend by doing almost nothing except showing up, suffering horribly, and then disappearing until next time. Fans quickly began to recognize the pattern. A new episode would start, everything would seem normal, and then suddenly, there he was, Hans Moleman, wandering into traffic, falling into a pit, or getting hit by something completely out of nowhere. And people started looking forward to it. They wanted to see what awful fate would befall him this time because it had become one of the most reliable running gags in television history. It didn't matter how dark or ridiculous the death was because The Simpsons treated it with total indifference. No dramatic music. No emotional reactions from other characters, just Hans Moleman being obliterated in some new way, while Springfield carried on like it was business as usual. That casualness made it even funnier. Over time, Hans Moleman started popping up in conversations among fans the same way people talked about the main cast. He became part of the show's DNA. There were fan theories, memes, online debates about how many times he had actually died, and even compilations counting every single one of his deaths in order. People started ranking their favorites, arguing about whether the football to the groin was funnier than the time he got buried alive or the time his car exploded for no reason. That level of obsession for a background character says everything about how much of an impact Hans Moleman made. The writers noticed this too. They saw that fans loved him and they leaned into it more and more as the seasons went on. Hans never became a fully fleshed out character with a backstory or development arc, but he didn't need one. In fact, the lack of backstory made him funnier because it kept the mystery alive. Who is Hans Moleman? Where does he come from? How old is he really? Is he immortal? The show never answers these questions, and that open-endedness lets fans keep imagining their own explanations. Some people like to think he's cursed. Others believe he's the only character who knows he's in a cartoon and just accepts his fate every time. Whatever the theory, the lack of answers only adds to his mythos. His legacy even stretches beyond the show itself. Hans Moleman has become a meme factory on the internet. Lines like "I was saying Burns" or "I only 31 years old" pop up everywhere, used in contexts far beyond The Simpsons. His image, tiny, wrinkled, always looking defeated, has become a symbol for bad luck, hopelessness, and dark humor all rolled into one. People who haven't even seen every episode of The Simpsons know who Hans Moleman is because his moments are shared and reshared online constantly. That's the kind of cultural footprint most side characters can only dream of. And here's the thing, The Simpsons has had hundreds of background characters over the decades, but very few have achieved the same level of recognition as Hans Moleman. Characters like Disco Stu, Crazy Cat Lady, or even Gil have their fans, sure, but Hans is in a league of his own. He represents a very specific kind of humor that The Simpsons perfected, this blend of slapstick violence, dark comedy, and total deadpan delivery. You laugh at his suffering, but you also kind of feel bad for him. And that strange mix of emotions is exactly what makes him so memorable. Even today, when new episodes come out, fans still keep an eye out for Hans Moleman. Will he appear? Will he meet another ridiculous end? Will we finally learn something about him? Usually the answer is no, and that's the beauty of it. Hans Moleman doesn't need new layers or emotional depth. He doesn't need a redemption arc. His entire purpose is to be there when you least expect him, to make you laugh with one perfectly timed moment of misfortune, and then vanish until the next time the writers decide to dust him off for another gag. Decades after his first appearance, Hans Moleman has secured his place in television history. Not as a hero, not as a villain, not even as a supporting character with a rich storyline, but as something much stranger and funnier, a legend built entirely on bad luck, dark humor, and the kind of running joke that never gets old no matter how many times you see it. And that brings us to the end of Hans Moleman's bizarre, tragic, and endlessly hilarious journey through the Simpsons universe. From his mysterious origins to his very first on-screen death, from the top 5 funniest demises to the wild fan theories about his immortality, from the writer's behind-the-scenes secrets to the incredible legacy he's built over decades. One thing is crystal clear: Hans Moleman has become so much more than just a running gag. He's a symbol of The Simpsons' unique brand of humor, where dark comedy, absurdity, and clever writing collide to create something truly unforgettable. Every time we see Hans Moleman wander into the frame, we know what's coming. We know it's going to be ridiculous, we know it's going to be quick, and we know we're going to laugh even though we probably shouldn't. That's the magic of Hans Moleman. He makes tragedy funny. He makes suffering entertaining, and he does it all without saying much or asking for the spotlight. He's the ultimate underdog in a town full of chaos, and somehow, against all odds, he's managed to carve out a permanent place in the hearts of Simpsons fans everywhere. So, the next time you watch The Simpsons and Hans Moleman shows up, take a moment to appreciate the genius of this tiny, unlucky, possibly immortal man. Because whether he's getting hit by a football, crashing his car, or falling into another pit, Hans Moleman will always be there, living or dying proof that sometimes the smallest characters leave the biggest impact.